All righty, let's get started. So again, welcome to FIJ's ongoing series of webinars inside the investigation. I'm Ellen Weiss. I'm Vice President of the FIJ board, and we have a super interesting project and grantee for today's discussion. Before we get into today's topic, I'm just going to do a quick run through of FIJ grants and how you can get awarded up to $10,000 to support your investigation. And I always like to ask if there's anybody watching who's received an FIJ grant. What type did you get? Just toss a comment, into the comments section. We'd love to hear and inspire people about the project that you worked on. Um, FIJ exists to support independent journalists to produce high quality, unbiased investigative stories that have impact. I mean, we actually want to give you money to do this work. Each year we give out, I think, more than close to 200 grants, maybe more. I'll fact check that. We have basically two kinds of grants. There are regular grants and there are seed grants. For a regular grant, what you want to do is think about a story like a story pitch for an editor. What's your main investigative question? What's new or uncovered for the first time? What's your reporting roadmap? Public records, interviews, observations, and then the preliminary findings that you've already figured out to say, yeah, I think there's really something there. Eligibility. All journalists are eligible, freelancers, staff at nonprofits, traditional outlets. We support all sorts of formats: text, documentaries, podcasts, photojournalism, books. A lot of people ask about international stories, and we will support an international story, but it has to have a U.S. either based reporter or a strong U.S. angle, something that affects citizens here, involves the government, businesses, and you also need it to be published in English in a US outlet. In general, these grants are for journalists, not for activists. So that's something to keep in mind. We're going to ask you for a budget. The things that we support: travel, data collection, small stipends. What we won't support is office space, buying equipment. Again, if you have any questions, I'm going to give you some resources at the end about where you can go. We have a lot of resources online, but also feel free to drop questions in the chat. The second kind of grant we give is called a seed grant, and that's up to $2,500 for initial reporting. And it's kind of that money that you need to help determine if a story is worth pursuing. So again, it will cover costs like maybe you need to just get a couple of open records to figure out, oh, are these open records accessible? Maybe you need an initial reporting trip. You've got to meet that source. You need a strong investigative idea, but you don't need the same initial findings or a commitment letter. You just kind of need to have an instinct that there's a story there. And then it's the same criteria in terms of who's eligible. So we have some deadlines coming up early next year. The regular grants are Monday, January 26th, Thursday, January 29th for the seed grants. And again, we'll go over this again at the end. We have a lot of resources on our site and also available to talk about this, throughout the conversation. I'm just going to check the chat. This is great. Wow, this is wonderful. Yeah, somebody's asking about Native American journalists working in 3 countries. Again, that feels like it has a very strong US angle, even while it may involve other countries as well. So that's really, that's the criteria. You don't necessarily have to be based here. It just has to have a connection. So, yeah, a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to talk with Beth for about 20-30 minutes. If you have questions, just add them whenever they occur to you in the Q&A. We are recording this webinar and we're going to post it in a tip sheet on the FIJ website. So you don't have to take notes. You're safe. You can put down your pencil. We promise we'll share everything with you. So over the course of these webinars, I was thinking about it. We've heard about some incredible reporting on abuse in prisons and jails across the country. But I gotta say, today's featured project and reporter have come at this topic from a really fresh and fascinating angle. Beth Shelburne has spent 13 years investigating the Alabama Department of Corrections and 1 year pulling court documents, financial records, internal documents to track settlements. These are settlements by the state over excessive force, wrongful death, failure to protect, medical neglect, and to examine what happened to the people involved. Her series Blood Money was 4 parts. It ran in the Alabama Reflector. And in that series, Beth revealed the state had spent tens of millions of dollars to settle nearly 100 lawsuits, again, alleging all sorts of assaults on inmates that led to hospitalizations, brain damage, even death. Now, most of that money went to attorneys for corrections officers. And some of the officers at the center of multiple allegations of excessive force received promotions afterward. So what Beth uncovered was not only a lack of accountability, but also kind of perverse incentives. And she revealed that the state was using taxpayer dollars to defend corrections officers accused of abuse. Her series really paints a very stark picture of how violence in prison isn't just a collection of isolated incidents, but obviously it's part of a broader systemic failure. Beth herself is an independent journalist and investigative reporter who focuses on issues of justice and injustice in the Deep South. Her award-winning work has been published in national and statewide newspapers, magazines, websites, but she also works in TV, podcasting, and documentary filmmaker. In fact, she's a co-producer of the current HBO documentary, The Alabama Solution, which premiered last month. She's based in Birmingham, Alabama. And what I really loved learning about Beth is when things get tough and she needs to keep her spirits up, she turns to her disco performance group. I mean, that is great advice, Beth. But let's begin, what first drew you to the story? What was your starting point for what seems like such a complicated issue?
It is incredibly complicated. And thanks for the nice introduction, Ellen. And thanks to everyone who's tuning in now and future viewings of the recording of this session. The seed for this was planted in 2016 when I was still working in traditional media as a television news reporter. And I wrote a story about a single lawsuit filed by a prisoner and against a abusive officer. The attorney who was representing the prisoner said to me, what would be a hell of a story would be to find out how many lawsuits the state is settling, because I know there are a lot of lawsuits ending in settlement. And I asked her, well, how could I find that out? She said, I don't know. And so that had been incubating in the back of my mind for almost a decade. I knew that the litigation and the lawsuit settlements were not being paid for out of Alabama's general fund budget, because despite all of the problems with transparency in this state, the state actually does a pretty good job of publishing spending out of the general fund budget on a dashboard called Alabama Checkbook. And you can search by agency, by subject, like legal spending. And so I knew with the data that's published on the general fund budget that there weren't plaintiff awards being reported. Fast forward to around 2022, when I'm working with the two directors of the Alabama Solution. One of them accompanied me to Montgomery, and we happened to be having a conversation with someone who worked in Alabama's Department of Finance. And we were talking about prison litigation. And I said, hey, let me ask you something. If a plaintiff lawsuit ends in a settlement, where does that money come from? because I can't find a record of it. And he said, oh, it comes out of a special fund. It's called the General Liability Trust Fund. I had never heard of this fund. And so then I realized there's another pot of money that we weren't aware of. And that's where I need to follow these lawsuits and seek out the information. So that's kind of how it started.
Great. I'm going to share my screen for a sec because you spent quite a bit of time on a guy named Cody Williams. And his story sort of captures so much of what you were trying to uncover. So let me, and I've been told I have a very busy desktop, so, I'll take some pride in that. Um, but yeah, here's Cody. And
Mhm.
maybe you can tell us kind of what sets him apart.
Well, Cody Williams, as a subject of this series, what set him apart is he survived the incident that he had with correctional officers when he was incarcerated in Alabama, lived to tell about it, sued the officer who beat him and broke his hip in a prison barber shop, and was willing to talk on the record to me about his experience. His case had already gone through the whole system and had ended in a paid settlement. And so not only did Cody agree to speak with me when I found him, he was actually in a drug rehab program in California that he self reported to after he left the Alabama Department of Corrections because his addiction issues had become so much worse while he was incarcerated, because our prison system, aside from having horrific excessive force issues, is also riddled with drugs and drug trafficking. But Cody was in a rehab center. He referred me to his attorney, and his attorney was able to share basically the whole case file, including discovery and transcripts of depositions that he had with the officers involved in this beating. And so it really provided a great roadmap to zoom in and kind of start from the very beginning and get to the very end of how does one of these lawsuits work? What does it look like? What is the system's response? And so we spent an entire piece just on Cody Williams' experience.
Great. Um, I'm pulling up an extraordinary document, one of a couple, that when you sent me the screenshot of it, I turned to the people I was with to show them because it's not something you usually see. And I wonder if you could tell us how you got this, and what it is.
So this is a pro se complaint filed by an incarcerated citizen back in 2014, and I believe it's settled in 2019. So you can see it's handwritten. This is the way that many of these lawsuits start: a handwritten complaint filed without an attorney, sent directly to the district federal court. Um, Judges at the district level will review these, or magistrates, and if it appears to be a credible complaint, then it will pass several procedural hurdles, and usually the judge will assign an attorney to represent the incarcerated plaintiff. They oftentimes will file an amended complaint that's then written by the attorney. But I found that the original complaints, these handwritten documents, really paint an incredibly compelling and dire situation that these men are in, feeling, in fear of their lives, afraid that they will be retaliated against for even filing the lawsuit, and just horrific accounts of abuse, neglect, and really torture in some cases.
Yeah, I'm just going to do a quick review of some of the other ones again, because, just to see, beat my head on the floor and squeeze my testicles and
Yeah.
again, just a sort of a kind of a unbelievably abusive behavior. Um, Beth, the numbers are staggering. that you found, $57 million spent on settlements and legal fees in the last 5 years. How did you trace where that money came from? And actually where it went, because that's also part of the story.
Well, when we had the conversation with the gentleman in the Department of Finance and he pointed us to this fund, we filed an original open records request or FOIA for 2 years worth of data from this fund. So we asked for all expenditures out of the General Liability Trust Fund, and we wanted the raw data from the Department of Finance. We got an Excel spreadsheet back, and it had an incredible amount of information, including case numbers that we were able to connect in PACER, the federal court database, to determine how many of these payments were connected to lawsuits against correctional officers. And it was the vast majority of expenditures out of the fund. The Department of Corrections, by and large, is the largest customer of this liability trust fund in Alabama. They're really an outlier compared to other agencies. And so I knew that this information was knowable at that point, and that's when I applied for the FIJ grant and asked for a decade's worth of material. This was also, in the context of a larger story in Alabama, and that's that the feds have been investigating for the exact same conditions that these individual plaintiffs are reporting in their lawsuits. And in fact, the Department of Justice sued the state of Alabama in 2020 for failing to correct a lot of the constitutional issues that the Department of Justice reported in its findings. And so that was sort of how I crafted my pitch to FIJ, is that this isn't really just a curiosity project. It's part of a larger story about federal intervention in our state and really, government dysfunction, that the government is arguing with the Department of Justice that these issues are not unconstitutional and systemic, while at the same time they're settling, a record number of lawsuits for millions of dollars of taxpayer money.
Yeah. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about this general liability trust fund. Um, as I understand it, and I could be wrong, most states have this. It's for defending state employees individually and paying settlements. But I wonder what you found about how did claims in this fund change from past years?
Yeah, so most states do have some sort of mechanism in place to protect state employees if they're sued on the job and to issue out any liability to people that are wronged by the state. And it's different in every state, and it's not always easy to figure out. But in Alabama, the General Liability Trust Fund was established about 50 years ago, and it operates much like insurance. Agencies pay a premium into the fund to participate, and that premium is based on the agency's usage of the fund. So that was one metric we could report. The Department of Corrections went from paying $1 million to almost $5 million in a 5-year period because their usage of the fund had gone up so much. In Alabama, the fund is capped at $1 million per claim. And so the way that works is when a lawsuit is filed, and the state hires attorneys or assigns attorneys in the Attorney General's office to represent the state employee who is sued, the fund starts depreciating. As the attorneys are billing against the fund, that pot of $1 million, that's for everybody involved. The plaintiff who is suing for damages, so their damages will come out of that $1 million, and the attorneys the state is hiring to defend the officers who were sued.
Yeah, so That's a weird set of incentives, right? Because, and what you found were the lawyers that were defending the Department of Corrections officers were actually getting more money than the prisoners who they were settling with.
Yeah, so we looked at a 5 year period. I filed the FOIA for 10 years worth of data, and that was helpful to see the trend over a decade. But I really studied the period from 2019 to 2024 when the Department of Justice was here on the ground investigating, filing its findings, and then eventually suing the state. And this also represented this like giant uptick in litigation, the number of lawsuits, the amount of cases ending in settlement, et cetera. The amount of money total that the Department of Corrections spent out of the General Liability Trust Fund in that time period was $17 million. But what we found, 4 million went to plaintiffs, and there were 124 plaintiffs that received settlements in that time period.
Mm.
13 million went to the attorneys that represented the accused officers. So the median settlement for an inmate plaintiff in this cohort of a 5 year period was $8,000. So by and large, the attorneys are really taking the lion's share of the money that's available out of this fund.
Wow. How did you go about verifying the accounts of the people who are incarcerated? You know, especially given how hard it can be for them to get, their voices heard.
Yeah, when I worked in traditional media, I remember there being this notion that incarcerated sources needed to be like triple fact checked because they couldn't be believed. I have not found that to be the case. I do try to verify their accounts, just like any other source. The best place to go, I have found, is the court system. Because they've made their way through the court system if they're in prison. And so Alabama has an online portal to access court records that I pay into. So I'll pull their court records to make sure what they're telling me about their case is accurately reflected in the court documents. I will ask them for outside sources that I can speak to that can verify their stories. So whether it's family members, attorneys, whoever they're connected with outside of the prison. And sometimes, they have other folks inside the prison system who can verify their claims, including other employees of the prison system that will speak to me on background and confirm things. So there's a variety of ways, and I just have found that I don't really view inmate sources any differently than any other source.
Yeah. As I said in the intro, a lot of the officers that were accused in multiple lawsuits are still on the job. Some were even promoted. Tell us a few of their stories.
Well, one of them is featured in the documentary, The Alabama Solution on HBO. And one of the incidents that he was involved in resulted in someone dying. And he has been since then promoted twice to the rank of lieutenant. One of the attorneys that represents inmate plaintiffs in these excessive force cases referred to this officer, Lieutenant Roderick Gadsden, and others like him as repeater beaters. That there are officers in the system that are engaging in this kind of behavior, and there's really nothing being done on the part of the prison administration. I pulled their personnel records, which are public record in Alabama. You can obtain a state employee's personnel file, and Roderick Gadsden, for example, had been sued over 20 times for excessive force in a 10-year period, and there is nothing in his personnel file reflecting anything alleged in these lawsuits, any incidents involving incarcerated people, no accusations of assault. I mean, it's like it never happened. And so that's where I think this is really not just a story about brutality that happens behind the walls of prison, but about a government that is dysfunctional, that is not using all of the information at its disposal to make sure it's keeping people safe. The officer that was involved in the assault on Cody Williams, his name is Akeem Edmonds, and he's another repeater beater who has been sued over and over again and promoted. And I should say that I reached out to both officers in this reporting. They did not respond with comments. I also reached out to the Department of Corrections for comment on these specific officers and all of these lawsuits, and they would not comment on any specific cases.
Wow. I'm going to toss out a question. Do you have recommendations for cultivating sources inside prisons to report on ongoing abuse in real time?
I think really just listening. I mean, I started covering what was going on in Alabama prisons in 2012. So this has been going on for a long time. And it was really the beginning was problems in the women's prison here. And I heard from many women after I started filing stories at WBRC, the TV station where I worked. I listened when women called me, I took their calls, and when women wrote me from the prison, I wrote them back and was able to establish some really good relationships that helped, really drive my reporting and inform what was really going on inside the system. And that's just kind of how it's worked. I have found that with prisons in particular, if you um, give people some time and provide some space to do some thoughtful reporting, the word gets around. And I
Mm,
have literally full plastic bins full of letters that I've received over the years because my name has kind of spread through the prison system as this is a journalist who will listen to you. Of course, I can't do a story on everyone, um, but it's an incredible need. And so it's really not hard to cultivate those sources.
yeah, those are great suggestions. You said you've been covering the Alabama prison system for 10 years. I- Um, what you described about the officers being promoted and stuff. I mean, was this a surprise to you in any way? Like, did you not expect to see that degree of, a lack of accountability and a lack of action taken against the repeat beaters, I think is what you call them.
Repeater beaters. Yeah.
Beater beaters.
The lack of action and accountability did not surprise me because that's been a long running feature of this system, unfortunately. Um, what did surprise me was the volume of lawsuits filed over excessive force. I expected to see some. I really expected that the bulk of the lawsuits that were ending in settlement would be wrongful deaths because Alabama has a very high body count coming out of our prisons. We have the highest prison mortality rate in the nation. And I expected there to be failure to protect lawsuits. So once I had synthesized all of the data that I got, which took about 3 months, it was a pretty tedious process. I realized, oh my God, the vast majority of these lawsuits are over excessive force. I didn't see that coming.
Yeah. Another question, were you able to get any helpful records directly from the Department of Corrections on reports against officers, into those allegations, and any disciplinary actions taken? We have been stonewalled by our Department of Corrections because they claim most records are personal records and therefore exempt from disclosure. Any
Yeah.
tip?
That's a problem with your state's open records law or whatever is written into your statute. Because if records are investigative in nature, that's often an exclusion to open records. What I have found is I've gotten a lot more information, not from the Department of Corrections, but from Alabama's Personnel Department. And so if there is another agency that manages kind of the HR arm of your state government. Surprisingly, personnel records in Alabama are public record, and any state employee, you can find out how much money they make. You can request their entire file. There'll be some redactions in there, but on Akeem Edmonds, for example, um, the officer who beat Cody Williams and is still employed. What we found in his personnel file, he's one of the few officers that's actually been charged criminally with abusing a prisoner. He was suspended during that investigation, and the Department of Corrections moved to fire him. This was not over the Cody Williams incident. This was a different incident. They moved to fire him. There was paperwork in there with them firing him. The charges were eventually dropped by the
Mm,
prosecutor because no one was willing to testify on the record that they had witnessed this beating because they were all incarcerated.
yeah.
And so the prosecutor didn't feel like he had enough evidence. The charges were dropped. Akeem Edmonds went to the personnel board and appealed his firing, and they reinstated him. So that was an incredible paper trail in his
Wow.
personnel file that showed us the difficulty in firing abusive officers because, if there's not really a very strong paper trail about the abuse, or if charges don't pan out, then the state often is at a loss for grounds for firing.
Right.
I
Right.
would say another really good place to start that I didn't know about until I did this reporting, and one of the sources I spoke to, who was a former corrections commissioner in another state, told me this. File a request for your system's use of force data. All prison systems have to keep track of how many times officers use force and how many potentially were investigated for excessive force. I filed for that and I got it from the Department of Corrections. It was raw data that I had to convert into some tables that made sense, but I still got it. You can ask for use of force data from jails too. Any kind of carceral institution is required to track that information, and it is public.
Those are such great suggestions. Um, uh, People are populating the chat and the
Mhm.
Q&A with questions, but please, start sending them in. We have a great question. Hi, Beth. I'm originally from Birmingham and was familiar with the DOJ lawsuit and your reporting. When I saw the Alabama solution a few weeks back, I thought I knew what was coming, but it still shocked and disgusted me in a whole new way. I'm curious what your experience producing the film was like and how it was different from your news reporting. Great question. And one I was going to ask myself.
Thank you for that question, Eli. Yeah, it wasn't really that different from my news reporting, except that it was like being on the same story for 6 years and not actually reporting the story until the 6 years was over. The beauty of investigative documentary is that you can take an incredible amount of time, and the two directors, Andrew Jarecki and Charlotte Kaufman, that's really their process. And their process is to also embed in whatever it is they're covering. And so they spent an incredible amount of time and resources here. And that included time with me and me connecting them to different folks to talk to and stories to follow. So it was much the same process that you engage in as a journalist doing any other story. Just it was sort of like a slow simmer for 6 years as opposed to like frying up the egg and serving it, same day.
Love that. Another question. I'm going to see if I can read this. Were you able to obtain information from the courts? How many lawsuits were dismissed because of procedural error? Um, they're asking about the Prison Litigation Reform Act of 1996. I don't know if you're familiar
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. The PLRA, it makes it incredibly difficult for people in prison to actually be successful when they sue prison officers, which makes the number of cases that have ended in paid settlement all the more remarkable because it is not easy to sue and to be successful if you are incarcerated. Um, I don't know how many cases were filed and dismissed, but I know that there's a lot. You know, the way that I started this was with the data on the cases that ended in settlement. And so the spreadsheet that I got from our finance department was every payment that had been made out of the general liability trust fund, along with a lot of other accompanying information, including a case number from Pacer, connected to the federal case number. There were two different kinds of expenditures: um, legal service payments, and that was the money that went to the lawyers, and indemnity payments. And an indemnity payment is a settlement payment. So that's where I started. I took the spreadsheet, I identified all of the indemnity payments, I moved all those into a new spreadsheet, and then from that, I identified which ones were connected to Department of Corrections officers and which ones were connected to other state employees. I extracted every lawsuit that had to do with any other state agency and then started with the 124 indemnity payments in my time period. And then I kind of worked backwards. So I was really interested in cases that had not been dismissed and had been, wound their way through the court and ended in a paid settlement to the plaintiffs. Pacer, I don't think would be able to tell you how many have ended
Mhm.
in dismissal. And it's hard because the cases are filed by a plaintiff, and that's what they're named, Jones versus Smith. And
Mhm.
so I think you would have to ask each individual court to figure that out for you. And I did not do that.
Mhm.
The Prison Litigation Reform Act was something that came up really when I talked to the attorneys that represented plaintiffs in these cases, and they just talked about the difficulties in extracting settlements, all of the procedural hurdles that that law creates, where it just makes it incredibly difficult and challenging for an incarcerated person to get legal relief.
Yeah, yeah. Another great question, and I would invite anybody on the webinar to try to help answer this since many people are dealing with this question now. Any suggestions about getting information about ICE detainees being housed in jails and prisons?
That's a great question, and obviously it's extremely timely. Um, I took a training session a couple years ago um, about covering jails that the Poynter Institute put on. And one of the folks that presented, I believe she was from the Marshall Project, said that, a journalist should be able to ask any government institution, whether it be a jail, a prison, a detention center, whatever, who is in your jail, how long have they been there, and why are they there? And if they cannot tell you those answers, then you need to find out why they can't tell you, because that is public information and it is in the public's interest to know these things. And so I haven't done this, but if I was to petition, say, the Etowah County Jail here in Alabama, which is also an ICE detention facility, I would say I want an inmate roster of everybody that you are holding for the federal government, their names and any other identifying information, how long you've had them, what they're in for.
That's
Um,
great advice.
and they should be able to produce that for you. And if they can't, then they need to answer why they can't.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And again, if anyone else is out there reporting this and having any success or has any tips, please just toss it into the chat. Um, Here's the glass half full question. Did you find any signs that the settlements led to changes, new training, oversight, accountability measures, or is the state just like paying the money to make the problem disappear?
Well, they definitely have been paying the money and
Yeah.
not really, not really addressing these things at a facility level because the lawsuits have been increasing and the incidents have been increasing. In fact, when I filed the FOIA for use of force data, I found that 2020 saw a record uses of force across the system. The same year of COVID, the same year,
Mm.
all the prisons were on lockdown. And, that had the highest number of uses of force. Um, the Department of Corrections commissioner has since told other reporters and announced in public forums that they have revamped their use of force policy and that they have instituted some new training. He did not say that was in response to this reporting, but he did say that after the reporting came out. Um, as far as like any accountability with these single particular officers, I haven't seen any, and I also haven't seen any urgency on the part of the Department of Corrections, the governor's office, or the attorney general's office.
Got it. Um, what about the correctional officers themselves? Were you able to speak with any of them? Did you hear from them after your reporting? Talk about how you were able to try to get their perspective into your reporting.
Yeah, I have always talked to correctional officers as well as incarcerated people. I find that the dynamics within the staff are often very similar to the dynamics between abusive officers and the prison population. There's many correctional officers that are not okay with that, but because the culture of the agency is so brutal, they don't feel like they have the ability to really speak out about it. They have to sign an NDA with the agency where they're not allowed to speak to reporters directly. And so there's often a lot of fear from correctional officers that speak to me directly, not just COs, but also other employees in the prison system. I have talked to nurses, social workers, mental health counselors. In fact, I just spoke to one former mental health counselor this morning who left the prison system after 5 years and has severe PTSD from what she endured as an employee. So there's a lot of parallels between what um, I guess good correctional employees are not corrupt correctional employees are experiencing inside this system with incarcerated people. There's more parallels than you would think, and I encourage journalists to always, speak to correctional officers that want to inform you about what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, moving up the food chain, did you get a sense that, political leaders in the legislature, the governor's office, attorney general's office understood, the depth of the problem and have any desire to fix it?
No, no one understood the depth of the problem. That's part of the reason I think it took me 16 months to produce this series because we didn't even understand it and we had to do a lot of reporting to try to understand it and then try to take all that source material and turn it into a narrative that people would want to read and could understand. I do think that there's a legislative prison oversight committee and this has landed in front of them. And there's one particular member. He's the legislator that has sponsored a lot of prison reform legislation. He's a good source of mine, and he has continually brought this up to the rest of the committee members. So they're sort of being forced to get a little uncomfortable with their friends that work in the Department of Finance and the Department of Risk Management in the Department of Corrections and ask them some serious questions. That hasn't really translated into any lasting change. But, I mean, the first step is we have to kind of know what the problem is and really take a look at it before we can fix it. And that really, I think, wasn't happening until this reporting was published.
Yeah. You mentioned both for some corrections officers and obviously for people who are incarcerated, you know, talking to an investigative reporter, can be dangerous, right? And I wonder how, if you have any suggestions for how you protect the people you spoke to, and also, yourself. You're listening to some really challenging stories. So how did you protect your sources?
Well, I think anybody who decides to report on any marginalized population, but particularly prisoners, because that is such an oppressed group of people, you have to kind of accept the reality that you won't be able to protect them from everything. You can certainly try to be safe, to find ways to communicate that they feel comfortable and secure doing. Um, but I think that there has to be some, inherent acceptance of the risk. I have a good friend who I've been talking to for years, and he says, it's like I live in Myanmar.
Mm.
I am in this other world. And, you can have like all the best intentions, but you can't really protect me from the dictator at the end of the day. So I think that has sort of helped me sleep better at night. And also knowing that incarcerated folks also understand that risk, but keeping open lines of communication with them about that. I always advocate that I don't use their names. Some of the folks want their names published. I actually had one man who guest wrote an essay for my Substack, and then I didn't publish his name, and he was like, "Why'd you leave my name off?" And I said, "Well, I was like trying to protect you." And he's like, "No, no, I want you to use my name." And he has a life without parole sentence. So some people, I follow their lead. I ask them what they want. Um, but I think at the end of the day, it's risky business. As for myself, um, I'm the child of a retired social worker, and I think I just have more space to kind of absorb a lot of difficult material and circumstances, and I find ways to take care of myself, which includes being in a disco performance group,
There
as you
you go.
mentioned.
That's a secret to your success, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the public reaction. I mean, obviously, you have, cracked open a whole new world of incarceration and accountability. Have you heard from the public? Has there been any response?
I have. I have heard from, citizens in Alabama that are outraged by this. I have heard more from academics who are interested in this and other investigative journalists who are interested in this. And I think that's great because when I was trying to sort out how this whole world works, I was speaking to a researcher on the West Coast who has published a lot of academic papers on litigation against abusive police officers on the street. And she hadn't looked at correctional officers in jails or prisons. And I asked her, why is there no like reporting on this? And she said, because it's really hard. When you're in a closed institution, none of us see any of this. The advent of cell phones has helped open up a lot of transparency with police violence because these incidents are now recorded. It's not the same, can of worms with prison violence, but police brutality and prison violence are really the same thing. It's another form of law enforcement brutality and abuse. So I'm glad that this reporting is causing other journalists to think about the institutions that they cover and what is it that they don't know that's happening, and potentially using civil litigation as a way to get a line in and figure out what's happening.
Yeah, that's great. I was going to ask you, you have spent such a concentrated time covering the Alabama prison system, but is this story repeatable elsewhere? And what would be sort of your suggestions of where someone could start?
I absolutely think it's repeatable. And there is a tip sheet. I think you're going to
Yep,
publish
we'll plug
that.
that. Mhm.
I think you have to first understand how your state or city or whatever, geographic area you're looking at handles civil litigation. How do they pay for it? Where does that payment come from? What agency is in charge of it? And then what does the process look like? Until I really got a handle on that, I was just continuously asking myself, like, how can I find this out? Where is it? And so it was this thing that was like nibbling at me for years. I think that once you get the lay of the land, then you just start filing records requests and trying to get your hands on the data, and expenditures connected to this litigation is one good data set that can be a good starting point.
Yeah. And maybe you've answered the next question, which I ask everybody, which is, what do you wish you knew when you began this reporting that you had to learn the hard way?
I thought this would take 3 months. It took 16 months. So I think in the future, when I file more grant proposals, I will make my proposal much more narrow. Um, when I filed this, I knew that I was going to be requesting a decade's worth of data. I wish that I would have given myself permission to just relax into it and take the time that it takes. My editor at the Alabama Reflector, Brian Lyman, who's brilliant, kept telling me this will take the time that it takes, because I felt an incredible amount of anxiety about publishing. Like, we've got to publish this. And, sometimes you don't have to publish something. You have to figure it out and really report it out in a way that is right, that is correct, and that people are going to want to read and be able to understand. And so I'm glad that we took the time that it took, but I wish that I would have not been so anxious at the beginning, because it was really keeping me up at night.
Sure, sure. Um, Folks, if you have any more questions for Beth, just toss them in. I've got one more to ask. And that is, could you offer one piece of advice or encouragement to people thinking about applying for a grant, an FIJ grant or any grant?
I think the advice is pretty simple: go for it. Trust your instincts, even if you're not really sure what you're going to get. This was a question that had been bubbling under the surface for me for many, many years. And I knew there was something there. I knew there was this whole landscape of things that were happening that were outside the purview of the general public, and that I had kind of a duty and an obligation to find it and to find a way to tell people about it. If you have something like that, as a journalist, that you are curious about, or you've got a sense that there is a need to really dig in and investigate something, then trust that instinct. And applying for a grant can be a great way to give yourself the time, space, and support to do that.
Oh, that's really great. If there are no more questions, I'm going to share my screen one more time so you can see how you can apply for a grant. Again, the seed grant is the one, like, you've got a gut for something, you think you've got a story, but you need to be able to research it a little bit more. So let me just put this on the screen. Beth has put together a tip sheet for doing this kind of reporting, where she has more tips than she shared today. We'll post that on the FIJ website. Everyone who registered, you're going to be getting an email from FIJ sometime next week or the week after with a link to the recording of the webinar and the tip sheet. Just again, a few important reminders: regular grants, January 26th. Seed grants, January 30th. I think I might have given the wrong date before. There's a ton of resources on the FIJ website, an FAQ, there's a video explainer. There are people to help you. We want you to prepare the best possible application. And then if you need anything else, just email us at grants@fij.org. This is our last webinar of the year, but hopefully we'll be back next year. Beth, thank you so much. This was awesome. And thanks to everybody who joined today. Have a wonderful weekend and a very happy Thanksgiving. Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Bye-bye.